Extra, extra. Step right up, folks, and welcome to another edition of B30 Back in Your Life. So it is without further delay that I say the following words. This segment will be the most unprofessional, yet sociological one yet. I guess the whole biblical and educational content motto is out the window for this one. So grab some wooden barrels and bring on the grapes, because I'll be doing a whole lot of whining. So basically, I'll be spending this session to share with you a little meet and greet I had with a pastor almost a month ago, which left me with a real bitter taste in my mouth. It made me think whether the Christian culture may or may not glorify the role of a Christian pastor. Okay, maybe some context and details would help explain where I'm going with this. So a while back, I applied for a pastoral position at a church near where I live, and shortly after, I get an email reply for an informal get-together. And then the dude tells me to bring my transcript. So I'm like, oh, okay, a little mixed message. If they're asking for a transcript, I guess they're seriously considering me for the position, so I'm already putting the cart before the horse, so to speak. I'm already thinking about how to plan out my lunch breaks and stuff. Anyway, the day comes for me to show up at the office, and little did I know, before I even stepped into the dude's office, I was never in contention as a legit candidate for the job in the first place, like not even close. So I walk through the door to the dude's office, and before I even reach over to shake his hand, he just tells me to sit down right away, and boom, cuts to the chase and says, "Describe your calling." I was like, oh, okay, we're going there right now? All right. So I start telling him basically how I've explored, challenged, questioned Christian faith and practice, and I truly identified with it. And while attending a graduate theology school, I realized I'm ready and willing to commit and serve at a full-time capacity. And then the interviewer / senior pastor stops me right there and then just takes over and goes off saying, see, and I will paraphrase, see, Moses encountered God in a burning bush, and Paul was blinded on Damascus Road. So let me share with you my pastoral calling. And then he just blabs on about, it's a particular verse in the Bible that I identify with so much. With that, I know I can persevere through anything because its assurance has such a spiritual effect on me. I'm like, that's it? That was the correct answer you were looking for? I could have made something like that up, too, but I didn't want to lie, and I don't want to get struck by lightning. But the interviewer then went on to explain the rationale behind the whole question of what is your calling. Now, I'm just paraphrasing what he kind of told me, but it went a little something like this. Pastoral care is a higher calling. You need to be called. You need some kind of spiritual experience to affirm this vocational path. Now, I'm assuming he's speaking on behalf of his, sacred pastor brotherhood, females included, of course. But he went on to confidently state that a heart of conviction, a heart of passion, a willingness to serve and learn is not enough. And then he goes off and blabs about how, as a pastor, you are a person of many hats. You're a general manager, you're an administrator, you're an event coordinator, you're a counselor, you're a public speaker. Basically, this multifaceted leader. Then he mentions how you'll be loved by many but hated by some, and that people in the past who have attempted to be full-time pastors got frustrated and the job demand basically broke them, and that they quit and they end up getting some other full-time job. So I'm like thinking, okay, I had no idea that the calling to be a pastor was in the same category as like doctors and nurses and firefighters and police enforcement. Sorry. Now this next part hurts the most. He then proceeds to ask for my transcript, which he told me to bring. And I'm thinking, dude, I'm totally tanking this meeting right now. I just want to leave, so I still have some shred of dignity left. Plus, I really want to save those $3 because it costs money to purchase that transcript. But then he insists on getting the transcript, so the dude rips it, breaks the seal, and boom, $3 gone. And he starts skimming my grades and courses. While he's doing that, he's like furrowing his brow and wrinkling his nose, and he's making like a duck face, and he's like muttering to himself. And he basically said to me, I don't like the courses you've taken. You should have taken this course or that course, and starts name dropping like all these professor names, saying like, oh, you should have taken courses from this guy or that guy. Oh, and I forgot to mention that I sort of told him I do a podcast, and then he's like, okay, and he looks it up on his desktop in front of me, and when he finds the page and the channel, he takes one look at my topics and postings, a good 5-10 seconds, and then makes kind of like a muttering noise, and then just closes off all the tabs. So, pardon my vulgar language, but what he basically did was, he took one glance of my work online, and without bookmarking it, like it ain't worth shit, then he just flat out says, go back to school, implying my degree, which took me 5 years, clawing tooth and nail to get, ain't worth shit, and it's overrated. So my heart just like sank into my stomach. Now this is super ironic because the senior pastor and me, we both went to the same school. But, excuse me, he got the degree that's 120 credits, and mine is only the measly 60. So I guess that's why he's talking to me like his shit don't stink. Okay, I'll stop the potty mouth. I'll stop right now. Rated G from here on out. So he then ends off the little meet and greet by saying how, oh, you can get back to me when you have a proper pastor degree. Get this, maybe I'll hook you up with an internship. I guess this is a good time to just stop here for a bit and make a disclaimer. For the record, let me just say, as upset and insulted as I was, the pastor or interviewer was rightfully entitled to his opinion. As an employer, he has every right to demand what he demanded from me. Me as in the potential employee. So I really have no right to be upset because I wasn't being discriminated against. I mean, at least he invited me for a meet and greet. The thing is, I was just not the suitable candidate. That's what it came down to. And I did in fact lack the proper experience and training for the position. So his assessment of me was indeed accurate and honest. With that being said, what I do find troubling about my interaction with this senior pastor is his view of the pastor has such a dominant role in the church. So, from a sociological perspective, his view of the Christian church is extremely stratified and it has a very rigid hierarchical structure. So have you ever thought about how, say, members of a church are divided into different categories, and then you realize they all have different levels of rank, authority, and status? When you think about it, say you're a typical newcomer, or you're a regular attendee, or you move up and you become a deacon, and then you have like pastors, and if you slip over to the Anglican Catholic side, you got your priests and cardinals and popes. So on the surface, we're all like, oh, we're a priesthood of believers, you know, that first Peter passage. But in reality, some members do indeed have more authority and status than others. Picture in your head a typical two-dimensional equilateral triangle with two corners at the base of the triangle and one corner on the top. Then draw two horizontal lines within the triangle. So you basically divided the triangle into 3 sections. So according to this senior pastor who interviewed me, his view of the church social structure is as follows. Surprise, surprise, at the top of the triangle are the pastors and ministers, and then in the middle section is the laity or the deacons and elders and whoever serves in the church. Then lastly, at the base of the triangle, where the 2 corners are, reside the general congregation. Look, I understand. This top-down view of the church structure, where the pastor or shepherd holds a prominent leadership role, is indeed orthodox. I mean, tradition really holds firm the biblical Greek words for presbyter, which means elder. I mean, they really take to heart the word deacon, which means like servers. And, the Greek word shepherd parallels pastors. Tradition holds a very high regard for these words in the New Testament letters of the first century. I'm not saying the traditional equilateral triangle model doesn't work, because let's face it, the church has been following this model for over a millennium and more. But the problem here is how rigidly defined these lines are in terms of your status within the church. So in my interview, the pastor was telling me that my MA in theology isn't good enough to join him and his fancy schmancy pastoral brotherhood, women included of course, at the top of the triangle. My educational training and experience, at best, will only land me in the middle section of the triangle. I'm not top of the triangle material, basically. And his reason why I can't make it is because I wasn't quote-unquote called, and I don't have the proper pastoral training or academic degree. Unless in the next couple days I'm called in the most mystical and hyper-spiritual way possible. And if I somehow get that extensive pastoral training, which is like 30 to 40K range in terms of expenses. So unless I get those two things, get called and get those fancy degrees, there is no upward mobility from general congregation to pastor, or there's no upward mobility from deacon to pastor. Now, I don't want to sound dramatic. This whole Western conception of the church social structure sort of resembles like India's caste or caste system, where if you're a dirty old poor peasant, that's it, man. That's your life. You're screwed. No upward mobility. So don't even think about being like wealthy. And similarly, in the church structure, there seems to be a resemblance with the caste system. In this case, my theological training and all that volunteer experience that I've accumulated serving at my home church for over a decade, that's not good enough. That's not enough to help me transition to the top of the pyramid. It really scares me how the religious Christian church sectors care about credentials just as much as, say, the business or engineering or service sectors in the secular world. Like, what seminary did you go to? Where did you do your internship? What or when was your calling? What degree did you get? Excuse me for not being quote-unquote qualified. Look, I'm not trying to be no revolutionary or advocating like Christian anarchism or Christian nihilism. All I'm saying is the triangle model, that equilateral triangle model of the church structure, needs to be seriously reevaluated and maybe perhaps reconstructed where there's more equal distribution of control and representation. So rather than have the pastors at the top of the triangle and us regular folk at the base of the triangle, why don't we try flipping the triangle upside down? Let's have the base of the triangle, which is us regular Joes, at the top, and the pastors and the clergymen at the bottom. So it kind of looks like a Superman logo, but without the S in the middle. Now, what this upside-down triangle paradigm of the church social structure signifies is that it empowers the people to have a greater role in serving within the church. That way, you're more in tune with meeting the needs of others. Plus, it makes you realize that when you walk into a church, the pastor is not your employer. They technically don't have the authority to tell you what to believe and how to believe it or how to act it out. But in terms of the black and white, what's on paper, the pastor technically is your employee. I mean, your offering and tithing money pays his or her salary. So if your pastor is walking around with an Android phone and using an iPad during a sermon, that's your hard-earned money paying for those fancy gadgets. Well, despite of it all, I do need to remind myself that the pastor is indeed a great source of social support, spiritual counsel, and educational inquiry at your disposal within the church. But you must realize he is or she is a public servant who works for you. So if you don't like what you hear or see, make your voice be heard. Now, I know some of you are probably thinking, dude, shut up. Know your role. The pastor knows what he or she's doing, so don't be all bitter and resentful and start talking like the church needs a social revolution. Now, that's a good point, but all I'm asking you folks today is to think about the equilateral triangle and then think about the upside down version of that triangle. And then just ask yourself, which model makes more sense when it comes to helping others and pleasing God? Okay, let's take all this triangle, model, social structure, hierarchy stuff, and let's just apply it in a real world practical setting. Let's go back to my example where I was being interviewed by this senior pastor. So instead of just having one senior pastor by himself interview me, maybe that interview should have had a deacon, a regular church member, and maybe a member of the youth fellowship, for example, to be present during the interview process. It's called a hiring or search committee. The goal of having more than one person in the decision-making process is to foster this concept called consensus, where the interests and needs of the church are well represented and given equal consideration. Here's the thing, though. What happened with me is the senior pastor interviewed me. He pretty much hated my guts. But who knows, if there were other members, like a deacon and a member of the ministry who I might be potentially serving at the interview, maybe some of them may have liked me. And they would have thought perhaps this candidate may help a specific aspect of our ministry that needs attention right now. Hypothetically, if they had a vote, it would be like a 2-to-1 majority decision. Say the deacon and the fellowship member like me and the pastor hates me. So 2-to-1, I technically get hired. But that's the thing. We will never know because that church, as a collective whole, authorized the senior pastor to screen the candidates by himself and ultimately make the final decision by himself on who makes the cut. So in this particular case, the two-dimensional equilateral triangle failed to give an opportunity to like a younger generation candidate. Now in the short term, I must admit the senior pastor made a wise choice because always choose experience. But in the long term, when the generation of Christians born in the 50s and 70s pass on, technically there will be no one to carry on the torch because the generation born in the 80s or mid-90s haven't been developed or given the opportunity to gain experience at a full-time capacity. So the question remains, just how relevant is the church in this new millennium, say 10 to 15 years from now? I mean, where will the younger generation get the opportunity to establish the church as a cornerstone in their local community? Okay, perhaps I need to mellow out a bit, take a step back, and maybe start wrapping things up. Look, I'm not stupid. I know I'm biased. I know I'm lacking objectivity in this issue. I'm basically a non-pastor talking trash on pastors. Honestly, how much of what I've said so far can you take seriously? But at the same time, I encountered a pastor who thinks pastors are the most essential profession in the modern world. So both the pastor and me in this situation are both pretty subjective, and we basically cancel each other out in terms of who's right, who's wrong, or whatever. But I guess that's my point, is the people have to decide for themselves what is best for them, instead of having a wise senior pastor or some crazy podcaster tell you what you want or need. And in order for the voice and the needs of the people to be heard, I'm just saying, doesn't the upside down triangle model work better than the current equilateral triangle model? All right, think about it. So give yourselves some time, let the point sink in, and we'll just finish it off here. So thanks for listening, and goodbye.